another new episode of Rustacean Station. This week we are looking at This Week in Rust, episode 446. Did I get that right? I think so. And my name is Tim McNamara. You'll know me online as Tim Clicks. And I'm joined by co-host Ellen Weimer and also, ta-da, the lead editor. Is that the title of This Week in Rust?
You've got it. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. I'm the lead editor. I'm definitely not the only editor, though.
Yeah. So actually, I'll go through the agenda and then I'll kind of slot in a space where I really would love to hear about how This Week in Rust operates. So the agenda for today. Actually, let's put Nell next and talk about herself and This Week in Rust. Then let's start with the quote of the week, the crate of the week. Let's chat about the official update that came through, as well as some highlights. And then if there's any space at the end, we can kind of give ourselves some buffer time to chat. Okay, Nell, tell me about This Week in Rust.
Certainly. This Week in Rust, as I imagine listeners to this, if they've listened to previous episodes, might know, is the weekly newsletter of the Rust community, highlighting all the fantastic things that are going on, articles people are writing. I mean, one of the best things about the Rustacean community is how dedicated people are to teaching through things like your book, Tim, and through the lots of tutorials, streams, etc. that people do. We're all teaching and we're all learning together. So we highlight articles along those lines, also Rust jobs, as well as cool things that are going on in Rust projects, and much more. I became lead editor, I think it was in early 2020 when I was at Mozilla, and have been really enjoying learning from the entire community ever since.
No, it's huge. I mean, do you feel like you have taken on quite a heavy weight, or have you sort of been able to shed a little bit of the weight over the last several months? Is that right?
It was a heavy weight when it was only me and one other editor briefly. Previously, it had been me and two other editors, but one had to take a break. But right now, I've got a lot of fellow editors who handle different sections using their GitHub username, which is what I mainly know them by. We have CD Mistman, Eric Seppen, and Extra Worst, or Extraverst, I suppose, if you say that with the German pronunciation. They handle the...
I only just made that joke. That's so good. Like, it sounded like...
Yep, they handle the updates from the Rust community section. We have LL Ajik, not quite sure how to pronounce that, who handles the quote of the week, the crate of the week, and the updates that have gone into the Rust project. We have Andrew Pollock and Marion Golden, who handle the event section. And then we have U007D. I have no idea how to pronounce that, but he's a fantastic person who handles the RFC, final comment period, etc. And then we also have a few backup editors for the updates from the Rust community. That includes Cole Harsam and Joel Marcy.
Oh, that's absolutely wonderful. So I should also kind of point out to anyone that is curious that this kind of little audio segment is in some sense kind of so Nell had several sort of episodes of Rustacean Station where she would kind of read it out. And Alan and I, well, Alan mostly has been nagging me for months to kind of get this thing going, but we kind of thought that kind of a more chatty format might suit kind of the audio kind of medium a little bit better. This is kind of probably the wrong space to ask this, but you might have listened to a couple of the episodes. How are we doing? Are we doing well by the newsletter?
Very much so. I've really enjoyed listening to your episodes, not just because I think the last one or the one before that featured a talk that I gave, but I think the chat format works really well because we're bringing in different contexts and different experiences with Rust by having more than one person. When I was doing it solo, honestly, I was very inspired by NPR, Morning Edition, things like that, which can work in certain contexts, and it was fun to do that, but I think the discussion format works really, really well. And I'm very glad you started it up again.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, let me kind of feedback to that. Like, I think the chatting one is a little bit more interesting because at least that's what I like about my news. It's like, give me the facts and then give me your opinion about the facts because sometimes I don't know actually how to digest it, right? I did like your style before, but the only problem was like I was working out in the morning, and so like I couldn't focus on everything you were saying.
Right.
And so at least if there's some chatter, then I could say, okay, now I kind of know how to think about this. Otherwise, it's like, well, what is that thing? Like, what is GAT? I keep hearing about GAT all the time, and yeet now is a new word I still don't understand. But at least, now I know that Tim doesn't also understand it, so I don't feel so bad anymore.
I'm
Yeet is
a
going to be.
few years
sorry.
too old, I think, to really understand it. I'm a cusp millennial, right between Generation X and millennial. But I've gathered some things from context about what yeet means. But if you ask me to give a definition, I'm not going to be able to.
Yeet is just going to be the stand-in. Like, it's now very quickly becoming the word that people that this little space is using for something they don't understand. Actually, this is a very good opportunity for me to kind of plug an idea that I really want to get some feedback from. So, if you're listening and you think, "Oh, maybe I should participate," how does one get onto This Week in Rust? Is one question that I have, and then the second. Actually, we'll answer that. So now, if I put up a post, am I allowed to say, please promote this on This Week in Rust?
Yes, the best way to make sure it comes to our attention, because yes, we monitor Reddit, we monitor a few other feeds, but the great thing is there's a ton of Rust content every week. The hard part of that is there may be something that we miss. So opening up a pull request on the This Week in Rust GitHub repository, I imagine we have show notes and we can put a link to that, is the absolute best way to make sure it comes to the editor's attention. You can also tag us on Twitter at This Week in Rust. Do you know, I usually only look at that like once or twice a week, but I will see it if you tweet at us there. And yes, it is absolutely fine to promote your own post or your own stream, etc. If you want to make sure it gets to the editor's attention, reach out to us directly, either through a pull request or on Twitter.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. So it's always crazy to kind of remember that there are humans on the other side of these Twitter accounts.
There are.
Right? The other thing is just a plug for this show. Over time, I don't want it. I would really like to kind of share the mic, and I think that if people like yourself, we can kind of have like a rotating gaggle of hosts. I think would be really wonderful. And I'm looking forward to there being episodes where it's Alan and I effectively out. And so if this is something that you'd be interested in, either participating on Rustacean Station on this segment or maybe even submitting your own audio, you're actually welcome to do that too. Rustacean Station itself is a community project. Okay. Right. So we are now sort of 8.5 minutes in. Let's start with kind of the body of the episode. Right. I like to start with the quote of the week just because I feel like it's a part of the newsletter that has a real human touch. And it's right down the bottom, and I think it's quite nice to kind of give it some airtime. So let's read out the quote of the week. This is a comment that was posted on Hacker News. I wrote a bespoke time series database in Rust a few years ago, and it has had exactly one issue since I stood it up in production, and that was due to the pessimistic file system access patterns rather than the language. This thing is handling hundreds of thousands of inserts per second, and it's even single-threaded, let's say. Given that I've been programming professionally for Rust I've been programming professionally for over a decade in Python, Perl, Ruby, C, C++, JavaScript, Java, and Rust, I'll pick Rust absolutely any time I want something running that I won't get called for at 3 a.m. to fix. It probably took me 5 times as long to write as if I did in Go or Python, but I guarantee it saved me 10 times as much time as I would have otherwise spent triaging, debugging, and running disaster recovery. That's the quote. So kind of a long description there of someone who has a production system that is just going and just continues to kind of chug along. Does that resonate with you two?
Very much. Prior to, I guess I should say, I'm at Microsoft now. I was previously at Mozilla. Prior to Mozilla, I did 3 startups in a row over 9 years. And I lived the on-call engineer life. And I remember little tiny things. I don't know if I should say what languages we were writing in because I don't want to do anything, but little tiny things because it was harder to do the right thing or harder to do the easier thing than it was to, goodness gracious. It was harder to do the right thing than it was to do the easier thing. Startups, there's always tremendous time pressure to get something out as fast as possible. So I think Rust emphasizes, it's in the compiler, you have to spend the time up front, but spending the time up front to make sure you do it correctly will save you so much time and energy. I remember I was woken up 7 times, I think, in one night? I think it was. And it wasn't just me who was not happy the next morning. My wife was really not happy this next morning because every time my phone goes off, it wakes her up too. So yes, this definitely resonates with me quite a bit.
Oh my goodness. Wow. Like I was worrying about I've had disturbed sleep, but 7 times, gosh. For me, it's kind of like actually memory leaks. I was going to say that just kind of things creeping up, and until your system kind of falls over, that's what really got me. Or I did lots of data science projects before working in Rust, and for me, you kind of get the scrappy code like written in like Jupyter notebooks, let's say, and kind of like somehow turn this into weirdly pseudo production, and then there'd be like some index error or type or like some kind of weird type bug or name error or something, and if those terms are familiar to you, you probably know that I'm chatting about Python. Again, it's not a slight on Python. It's just it's really so refreshing that Rust provides kind of this kind of, it just steers you towards the right path. There is something I think might be a bit of a theme for today's show, which is talking about kind of this trade-off between spending effort and kind of mental energy up front versus the payoff that is going to come through later on. Because that, when you're picking up there'll be many people who listen who are finding Rust really challenging because they're attempting to say, write C# in Rust or write Java in Rust. And there are certain patterns that really don't fit well, or it's kind of like cutting against the grain. Right. So what about you, Alan? I've been chatting a lot. How many of your Rust systems have fallen over?
0, actually. I have one piece of a system written in Rust, just to speed up the whole thing in production, and it made life easier. Like, it was a huge gamble. It did take me quite some time. Clippy scared the hell out of me because I was already in production before I even ran Clippy the first time. But in the end, like, I think I learned so much more, and I've always been this kind of guy who wants to get into low-level programming. And with Rust, I feel like there's no reason why you cannot. It really knocks a lot of things out. But like, let's not forget about the memory leak thing you brought up, right? Didn't we cover an article last week about memory leaks and how there's actually memory leaks within tracing? So you're not infallible.
Right. So Rust isn't a panacea, especially when it comes to memory leaks, because, and I think Sean Chen made the point that a memory leak is not a safety issue, and therefore, in some sense, permitted by the compiler. We can leak in safe Rust. However, and I say, because Rust kind of produces less garbage, or kind of has less kind of, there are fewer like short-lived objects, and just I have personally found it to be much more deterministic with memory usage. It might be a better way. But if I have long-running servers, if I had a long-running server, say, running behind Nginx, it's very common to kind of restart the server process like after every 10,000 requests, say, which I think in Python is quite common. There are like triggers inside inside a couple of, like in uWhiskey, for example, that say, like, please just reboot the thing. And I think in the Rust world, that's less common. It's probably still out there. But yeah, no, as you mentioned, Rust doesn't provide this kind of guarantee at compile time that your program will be free of memory leaks. Okay, cool. Let's move on to the crate of the week. The crate of the week is OSM osmpbf. This will feel relatively obscure, possibly, if you've never used OpenStreetMap. So OpenStreetMap, this crate is a reader for a file format produced by the OpenStreetMap format. And what's OpenStreetMap? OpenStreetMap is a kind of the Wikipedia of maps. It enables you to go and annotate the world map. And it's kind of a collaborative project that's used by, let's say, hundreds of thousands of companies and individuals worldwide now at this point.
Also very useful for humanitarian organizations when they're dealing with the aftermath of a giant earthquake or a hurricane, when the roads have changed physically. They're able to upload it to there and feed it out to everyone else so they know where to go.
Yeah, and a small plug actually for the humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, of which I am still technically a member, but I have been kind of dormant in the community for a while. I'll link to that because there are bound to be people who are curious. As far as the crate goes, it's really exciting to me to see that we are having that the Rust community is kind of people are leaning into Rust for things like this low-level munging of data, or we have a binary file format here, and we want to provide a very fast and unobtrusive interface to enable other people to get work done. As far as this crate goes, all of the low-level pieces seem to be in there, but I think that, and we're only at 0.2, but I think that there is kind of an opportunity for a high-level interface because there are bits and pieces. I had a quick look at the API, and you need to kind of toggle on and off when you want certain sections decompressed, for example. So, this is super exciting. Next section, the official updates. In 4.4.6, we had a single official update provided by the Rust compiler team. This was the Rust compiler June 2022 steering cycle post, which described the plan for the next 4 meetings. By the time that this show goes to air, all of those meetings probably would have already happened. But what I thought was really interesting is just to emphasize that the Rust project is taking the time, or at least the compiler team is taking the time to say, this is how we want to use our time. And they really emphasize getting the most value out of their synchronous meetings. So in fact, one way of digging into this is they spend 1 meeting out of 4 chatting about the next 4 meetings, such that they really boost, they get everyone kind of maximum impact for all that time together. How do the other teams operate now? You might have more visibility or at least exposure to how people run about, or how each of these Rust teams does their work.
Well, I know with the community team, which I am on as being lead editor of This Week in Rust, they meet, I think, once a month. I don't think it's on video call. I haven't been to a meeting in a while, to be honest, but collaboratively in a Discord channel. And then I used to be on the async team, which would meet once a week. And that would be synchronous communication on Zulip. And then it could easily be spun off into, async work. I know with the cross-team collaboration fun times, meeting that Nico does. I love that name very, very much. It rotates, I think it's once a month, but it rotates what time zone it's the most convenient for and most inconvenient, which I think is a good approach, because scheduling a meeting that works for North America, Europe, Asia, and Australia is not going to happen. I try to do it. It doesn't work. So they rotate it. And again, I think I like the compiler team's approach, particularly with the compiler having such a very high or a very big surface area, that knowing what you're going to talk about before the meeting lets everyone prepare. And also, it doesn't always prevent the meeting from going off on tangents, but it helps everyone come in with a focus. And when synchronous time is so precious, because we're all in such different time zones, that's really, really important.
It's nice to know as well that, again, there are still humans on the other side of the screen, right? And sometimes people chat, and that's also really positive. There was one little thread that I would love to expand upon. You mentioned that one of the teams, used Discord and the other used Zulip. this seems like a very low barrier to entry, or at least a very low barrier to participate or observe. And likewise with the compiler team, the meetings also occur as text-based in Zulip chat, and therefore, if you're curious, you're more than welcome to lurk. I think that would be seen as quite positive, and there's no pressure, or at least there's probably very little pressure. Great. Oh, unless there was something from Alan, do you want to kind of chat about compilers or synchronous meetings or living in Hong Kong and having people schedule things like podcast interviews?
Yeah, it's a pain in the ass. I can tell you that much. Sorry to use the bad language, but sometimes there's no other word for it. But I mean, at the same time, like I always try to make myself as available as possible. Like Tim, I've been trying to schedule you for an interview still, even though we're this close. I still always try to schedule you for an interview. And it's not easy, right? Even though I leave my schedule open from like 7 or 6 in the morning until like 11 p.m. at night. It's not easy, right? Everybody's busy, And I thought we were going with this, but yeah, it's not easy to coordinate like people in Europe, Asia, and US. I do that actually.
That was a very subtle and very interesting dig. Just as a strange aside, Ellen and I had an interview. We recorded half of an episode back in like December last year, and we've been trying to find another time to finish the last half. And I feel like part 2 probably would be so disjointed from the first one now, partially because I've had a couple of things happen in my career. The book is now another several months out. It'll be really interesting to see. But anyway, I shall park that discussion. Let's get on to the highlights for the newsletter.
All right.
And so so I've got a couple here. Ellen, do you want to start us off with your pick of the week, or let's say your top pick of the week?
Well, if we're going off of what you wrote down already, let's work backwards from what I have written down, but it's okay. Async Rust doesn't have to be hard. It's an interesting article. So my kind of summary is that basically it's a rebuttal for Rust is Hard article, which I think was the last week. The author was not very happy with that article at all because he thinks that Rust is not that hard unless you're doing some systems programming, which the other guy was. And I believe the article before was actually kind of talking about async not being so great, but the author said that he actually learned Rust by doing all his code to be asynchronous. And so it's an interesting read. I mean, I think it's good to read the first article, then the second one, and then you can kind of come back with something, right? Everybody has their own side. And I think the other thing, too, it's quite interesting, and I think it's very true, is that most people are not going to be doing systems programming. They're going to be doing application programming, in my opinion. And I think that's also his opinion, too. Most people are building applications with Rust rather than actually doing systems programming with it. Overall, good article. He goes into the details. I think you should check it out.
Nell, do you find yourself apologizing for Rust's difficulty?
Asking me? Oh, sorry. I thought you were asking me.
I find myself expressing empathy quite a bit. And I think it has improved massively over the past several years. But I do remember the hockey stick learning curve. And I think that for someone who's coming from a Ruby background or a Python background, most of their experience is likely in application programming and being able to approach Rust from an application programming perspective and then move to the systems level. Whereas if you're coming from C++, you might immediately move to the systems level. It speaks to a lot of different experiences. And I think I remember a point in the article too was, I don't know if it was in the article, but I thought of it as I read it. Async is great. It's not appropriate for every scenario. And I think when you're trying to jam it into a scenario where it may not be appropriate or it may not be the best option or you may not get a lot out of it for the cost of the complexity that it adds, I think that is a place where a lot of frustration comes in. So I know as the Rust community, we've been very, very happy with async. We've been all over it because it was new and it let us do new things. But that doesn't mean it's appropriate for every single programming situation you find yourself in.
What about you? Sorry for cutting off just then, Alan. Do you find yourself apologizing for Rust's difficulty?
No, I think that, it depends. I mean, first of all, I didn't design a language, if that's what you're trying to say. But the second thing is programming is not easy. It's not for everybody. And sorry, but asynchronous stuff is not simple. I mean, all you're doing is writing some asynchronous code, but the stuff that actually runs the asynchronous stuff is really tough stuff. Just be thankful we have what we have, right? I mean, the problems that Rust solves and gives you guarantees for are not easy. And it's taken a long time to get to where we are right now. Now, the stuff underneath the hood, that's the tricky bits, right? So in the end, Yes, it's not going to be easy, but just think that you're already having a lot more easier time than the people before you and the people who built the stuff underneath for you.
I'm definitely I kind of want to scratch my chin a little bit about that statement because there is it's kind of this thing about like how much accidental complexity versus intrinsic complexity has Rust kind of layered on the top. And I think yes, it's a learning curve, right? It just as finding some other vocation, some other skill, it requires practice, and there is a cost to picking up a new tool, and that involves a whole new paradigm. There's a new way of communicating. Rust is very deliberate in that it kind of bakes in, like participating in the Rust community, the code of conduct and some community norms have kind of been baked in right from the beginning. And that is in opposition to other communities which have been kind of in some sense deliberately neutral, which actually in my personal experience has meant that silences voices that aren't from the majority. But I think I'm sure that there's a very wide diversity of views about whether or not, like, how far Rust should bend towards being accessible. One thing that I really love about Rust is its error messages. And like the Rust compiler sort of says, I want to be your coach. Like, if you have a problem that you can't solve for yourself, that's actually my problem. And I know that the people who do build the compiler really, really care about trying to find places where you kind of get like stuck in a hole and you can't pull yourself out because you don't have the cognitive like tools to get yourself back out of the hole. And there is one quote that I really want to pull out of the article, if you'll forgive me. It really resonated with me, which is this idea that we have a kind of two sides of a coin happening. Like, we have these posts which come in and say, Rust is really challenging, it's really difficult, like a lot of people that are getting extremely frustrated. But also the empirical evidence suggests that once you learn, Rust is genuinely loved by developers. It is consistently ranked as the Stack Overflow survey has been prominent for multiple years, and like both of these, it feels like these are in contradiction. And I think to kind of like emphasize or reinforce Nell's point, you have a once you get there, I think that things kind of click, or at least that maybe I just suddenly got a weird crazy memory blank thing happening. But anyway, I shall move on.
When I keynoted RustConf last year, a point I made was in the Rust community, no one calls you a noob as you're learning it. And I felt my age a little bit because a couple of people responded with, "What's a noob?" And someone said, "Oh, that's a term from the early days of the internet." And I said, "Thank you." The reason it continues to be so successful is because the deeply supportive community and how people will have your back and lift you up as you're learning it.
Yeah, you noob. Just kidding.
Just kind of.
Did you think you were in a World of Warcraft raid for a second there?
No, actually, I don't even play that. I'm probably the in between geeky and non-geekyism. So
gotcha.
I feel like the complete noob for video games, so it's okay.
I guess I better chat about something next. I really want to pull out something that you may have missed, which this week we wanted to talk about. There was a PR for a Clippy book. Now, this is a piece of work from Josh Rottenberg, and it's an idea that's kind of been bubbling around since late 2020 that we should provide a guide for Clippy. As Alan mentioned, Clippy's really it just kind of, you discover it in some documentation somewhere that you should run cargo Clippy, and then once you do, suddenly you've got pages and pages and pages of warnings, or
you crap yourself basically.
Right.
You're like, right. Oh my God, how come the compiler didn't save me? That's what I usually think. That's what I thought the first time. What happened to the compiler? It didn't save me.
I just continually am terrified about the fact that Clippy is a better programmer than I am. So I just want to kind of plug that as my topic.
I like the Rust Clippy a lot more than the Microsoft Clippy. Even saying that as an employee of Microsoft, it's quite helpful.
Yeah. No, I'll pause. Nell, do you want to give us an article that you really enjoyed or a piece of the newsletter?
Sure. I would say it was one of the RFCs, which I believe it's either currently in final comment period or was in final comment period when this issue went out. And that is around rolling co-lead roles for the compiler team, bringing things back to the compiler team. This RFC is by Felix Klock, who I used to work with at Mozilla, and I liked it because it addresses one of the biggest issues in open source, no matter what language or ecosystem you're in, which is burnout among leaders and knowledge, that leaders' context and knowledge being lost when they reach the point where they can't do it anymore. And I've experienced this myself. There's a point where physically your body cannot do what you've been doing for so long anymore. And the best way to address that is before it happens. So this RFC proposes establishing rolling leadership within the compiler team. The compiler team will have 2 leads, a senior lead and junior lead at any given time. And then roughly every 1 to 2 years, a new junior lead will be selected. Current junior will be promoted to senior, and the current senior will return to being a normal compiler team member. And what I like about this is it ensures that there's not a loss of both technical and the team context, because if you're going to be a leader in open source, you need to understand how different people work and how to make that work as a team. And it also I think it's a good approach. One of the things they mention is rolling, not rotation. Not every team member needs to be a lead. A lead is not necessarily rotated. If you don't want to be a lead, you don't have to be. Also, this was an interesting point in it, which was selection, not election, in that it's not that the new leaders of the team will be democratically elected. It's the senior lead will have final say on who the next junior lead will be. And I think they explicitly say part of the motivation on this is to, it's critical that the leads have compatible working styles. I remember a bit of American history, early in the first days of the US, when 2 people were running for president, whoever came in second would be the vice president. And that got changed because 2 people have been running against each other in an election. They're probably not going to have compatible working styles, and it's going to introduce a lot of drama that doesn't need to be there. So I think this is a great way of approaching the problem with burnout in open source, and also dealing with one of the biggest risks is loss of not just technical knowledge, but also team and community knowledge. And this ensures that that's shared among team members.
Wow. No, that's really, I'm kind of thinking this through. And this is a very mature step, I think, that a recognition that, humans are humans is, and also, I think this is really positive. And also, balancing this desire for having kind of the right person or the quote unquote best person in the leadership role, but also recognizing that it's super tough. And also, you kind of want to give space for others to kind of demonstrate that they are worthy is the wrong word, but that's kind of what's coming to mind. But I also want to just kind of Florian Gilcher or Gilcher, as you probably may, also did this, right? He kind of very deliberately said, my time here, I've been in a leadership position, I think, for approximately sort of 5 years or so. And he kind of gave himself like almost a year of contingency where he kind of stood back to kind of provide oxygen for other people in leadership roles, which I think, again, I don't know if this had anything to do with that, but I don't know if this RFC is related to that. But no, it really strikes me as a very mature way to kind of do teamwork. Alan, any kind of like philosophical thoughts coming out of sparking off there?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think the only issue I see is if you do find somebody who is really fit for that role, and then you kind of they have to step aside. I think that could be a slight issue, but maybe it is good to get some new blood in and see what happens.
It's good to set the expectation up front that the time in leadership will be limited.
Yeah, so maybe the investment may go down from the new guy's side, right? I'm sorry, I always like to provide the devil's advocate for everything, right? And I think that's something to think about. But overall, I mean, it is good to stop. I think the biggest issue in Rust participation and volunteerism is burnout. And it's like if you're doing a good job and people recognize it, like then you feel guilty and you want to keep going, and not even like you lose the interest of yourself wanting to do it, and then you do it because you have an expectation from other people, and that is something that is dangerous.
One of the things I've told people, based on my own experience, it's impossible to push through burnout and come out on the other side okay. You had a very nasty case of it a few years ago, and I'm still dealing with the physical effects. It's not just mental and emotional frustration, though those are very real, but the way it physically affected my body, I'm still dealing with that today. So anything that can be done to avoid that, I think, is a good step for the Rust project to take.
And especially given that you're more likely to suffer from burnout when you are really deeply emotionally involved, right? And I think people have a genuine, this is something that I'm trying quite conscious of, that I feel that Rust has there's a space there for Rust to genuinely have a positive impact on the software industry worldwide, because more and more of the world is reliant on software. Therefore, we should have better tools to produce stronger software. But I'm getting questions both from people that I love and also from kind of people that follow me online, just saying like, how do you survive? And one of the things that I need to be very conscious of is that I'm finite, and this is something that I am personally finding super challenging, actually, because I just have this sense of wanting to help, but also recognizing that I need to prioritize myself as well. Alan, what was your next highlight from the newsletter?
Well, going in order of whoever wrote this, looks like it's Hyper versus Rocket. Very good article. I think it's interesting to kind of see the difference between the two, trade-offs and minuses. It's a very quick read. I think if you're interested in web development, check it out. You'll get pretty interested. They just basically do they have very simple requirements. That's what I wrote down. So they compare on routing, shared states, and you can only use the bare bones of the library or the dependencies that they depend upon to build this. And it's nice to see, actually, you can just use Hyper to build something instead of actually having to say I have to use Rocket or I have to use Active. You just use Hyper directly. And it's interesting to see all that stuff. And obviously the very quick rundown what the end of results were. Obviously, Hyper is faster to compile, faster to run, but Rocket is much more clean, easy to understand, and the coding approach is, I think, much more friendly to people, right? So talk about beginners will really much enjoy Rocket to this because it's very much similar to, I would say, Flask, if you're used to Flask. So yeah, check it out. It's pretty cool.
Rocket has my all-time favorite method in Rust, which is Ignite.
Yeah, I love cute names. Like, as much as I hate them, because they're kind of impossible to discover. I love when people take a metaphor and just kind of take it as far as it needs to go. The one thing that I dislike about the Rocket API is this kind of word fearings, which I don't quite understand. But Ignite is just perfect, isn't it? It's just the whole thing. Rocket is a very programmer-centric, kind of a Rails-esque web
That's
API.
what I was thinking too. It reminds me of Rails quite a bit.
Yeah, and in fact, it kind of as a weird throwback to 2013. Steve Klabnik wrote an article just talking about how Rust can be expressive as well. In Ruby land, you can just kind of in Rails did this. It just monkey patched integers, so you'd say like 4 dot days, and you'd get out an object which it creates a duration, and it will represent some span in time. And just this discussion that he and Yehuda Katz had, they say you can actually do a very similar thing in Rust. And so I think we're finally at the point with procedural macros, async, and a bunch of other stuff, which means that Rust has an opportunity to be accessible and performant and safe and stable. I shouldn't be flowering Rust with accolades because it still is just a programming language. Like, it's just a tool. But I also want to shout out the company that wrote the blog post is one of these kind of new infrastructure companies. It's a little new startup called Shuttle, and there just seems to be a whole bunch of these kind of other new startups like Fermion and a bunch of other Fly.io, which we kind of take a WASM thing and just get it to run. And again, I shouldn't flower or just kind of what was I saying? Shower Rust and accolades, but it just seems like kind of Rust has the whole package, which means that we've got an accessible programming language. It runs really fast. It's easy to keep up, and it's really easy to deploy. So I will keep talking. The post that I really wanted to chat about next is this thing called macro patterns. Now, the macro patterns blog post is interesting for me in a slightly different reason. And so the post is entitled Macro Patterns, a Match Made in Heaven. And ostensibly, it's talking about macros. But once you dig into the post, there's a whole bunch of content which relates to kind of things like how the debug trait works and how in some of the guts of Rust actually get work. And so there's kind of like this hidden bonus reading through this. Actually, you learn a lot about how pattern matching works, which I found really, really helpful. So that was my next bit.
I love articles where I click on the title and I think it's going to be about something very specific. And it is. It's not clickbait. There certainly are macros in this article, but the depth, I get so much more depth than I expected, and I learned something new. I love, love, love articles like this.
Now, should we circle back to you? Do you have another post that you'd like to share?
I do, and that is Web Scraping with Rust by Ginstraymanis. I sincerely apologize if I butchered that, but I like this a lot. It's about web scraping, and it brought me back to, again, earlier days in the internet, where APIs were not as common, and if you wanted to gather everything that was on a web page or crawl a site, gather everything on all the sites and those pages, you used a web scraper. And I also love the example, which was scraping the top 100 movies list from IMDb. I'm a big movie fan myself. And I noticed it uses the request spelled REQWEST. I get that it's a cute name, but I misspelled that in my code more times than
I know.
Can go into.
Totally.
But
totally
it's a very useful crate, as long as I can spell the thing right.
That's right.
For doing web calls. So I like this article a lot. I think someone who's getting started, again, coming from that application programming background. I think my very first Python project years ago was writing a web scraper in Python. So it's a good way to get to know the language with a common problem, and it's something that lets you see results right away. So definitely check it out.
Nice. And one of my favorite quotes is that like the web page is the API.
That's a good point. Yep.
Yeah. Right. Like if a web server provides the HTML, then you can extract the structured data. Do you did you get a chance to look through this one, Alan?
No, I did not. But I can imagine. I did interview MacArthur. I think his name is MacArthur. Is that right? Last time I called him Arthur, and that was wrong. But MacArthur. And fantastic episode. Also, for that library, it is asynchronous, but also they have a synchronous API. So I like the fact that that library does provide both. So in case you don't want to do async, you cannot use it. Is that how to say it?
You're saying you can opt out from async? Is that
That's why your English is better than mine. So
I got quite grumpy with them, quite stroppy because pre-async, like it was just a synchronous API for request, and then they moved to async first, and I was like, I don't want to have to learn async to download a web page. But yeah.
One more comment. I know the name can be annoying, but it's a lot better than Go, because if you try looking for Go in the early days, you couldn't find anything or things like that. These kind of names. So the name is actually
it is
easy to find things.
Yeah, that is
easy to find ARG stuff. Yeah,
yeah.
And you really don't want to kind of you really don't want to run up against like Python requests, do you? If you were going to write and create a library. Okay, where are we at now? The who wants to go next? Do we have left on the queue? I've got one. I think I've got one left. Okay, let's talk about Rust types. And so this is just a glorious write-up of John Genset's kind of Twitter thread. So he kind of like put out this thing, one of the nicest people in the Rust community, just to, give me a type. And I'll give you I'll give you a TIL. I'll give you something to some kind of like little knowledge nugget. And there are now dozens of these things. And I'm like, how does one individual know so much in so many interesting little corners and nooks and crannies of Rust? But there you are. They're all written. And I just thought it was great. And just kind of like circle, like as a throwback to the start of the episode, there are so many knowledgeable people inside the Rust community who are just exceptionally helpful. And I continue to learn things all the time.
I also quite like that this post he pulls everything off Twitter. It can be hard to find things on Twitter after it's been a few weeks, and puts them in one place. So anyone else who's wondering about these will have a place to reference them. So thank you, whoever wrote this article. I'm looking for the name. Whoever compiled this. I don't know, but thank you very much. Prefaced by Jimmy Hartzell. Thank you very much for this.
Thanks, Jimmy. Yeah, no, we were all scrambling to find Control F or something. But right, okay. So we've kind of hit the formal part of the discussion. We're doing pretty well for time, I suppose, in some sense, if we give ourselves an hour of time on the clock. Was there anything else that people wanted to chat about?
I do have one last article. I can be very quick about this one too.
Apologies. I shouldn't have done. Okay. No. Absolutely. Please. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No worries. Mine's very, very quick and straightforward. I didn't see it in the list, but on my list, it's Rust explosive popularity comes with unique challenges. I like this article because everybody always thinks that every language is about the language itself, syntax, compiler, etc. But you guys forget about not you guys, but everybody always forgets about all of the infrastructure involved and all the difficulties with that. So some stats that they pull out is that it is being used more and more in enterprises nowadays. There's some also interesting stats too. About 2/3 of Linux bugs are memory related. The famous 70% of Microsoft issues are memory related. 67% of the 58 zero-day bugs in 2021 in Chrome, I believe is what it was. I forgot to write down the project, is also memory related.
Yeah, I think those were uncritical vulnerabilities exposed through the Google. Google has a Project Zero, kind of a group that goes and hunts for bugs inside really high prominent open source projects. That's what I believe.
Okay.
It's fascinating to me that this kind of 70% figure keeps popping up in various places. And it's kind of scary to me. And I'm just so grateful that Rust kind of exists.
Yeah,
but
I know that report well from the Microsoft Security Research Center. I think that's the abbreviation. And they mentioned that those very likely could have been, in fact, most, if not all of them, would have been prevented if the code was written in Rust rather than C++.
There is one more thing I think is even more important than those, because those are basically old news, right? That chart is, I don't even know, 5 years old now or something. It's ridiculously old in computer times. What I think is much more important is related to a podcast that I released about 2 weeks ago with Rebecca Rumble talking about Rust Foundation.
Rebecca Rumble is so fantastic. I'm on the Rust Foundation board and love working with her.
She's a tough cookie, but I think she's fair, right? My dealing with her.
And that's exactly what we need. Yeah.
Yes. No, I no way am I poking fun. I think that's exactly what every place needs. Like, she's, from discussing with her, I feel like she's able to make the tough decisions and live with them and absorb all of the feedback that comes back from that. And I think that's exactly what you need. And she's able to diffuse, like if somebody says, "Oh, I don't like this," she's able to accept it and say, "Okay, well, I understand your side, but we need to do this." But one more thing is that what Rust Foundation is doing now is really important. Also DevX, all those other parts. And what I'm trying to say is that they're handing out money to people that actually need it. It's not a lot. You're not going to get rich from working on Rust, but it's something. And a lot of these big companies are not always doing that. Sure, they employ a lot of the prominent people for prominent projects, but there's a lot more than just that, right? Those guys also rely on other libraries usually. And the hardest thing is that companies usually want to influence the language, but then at the same time, you need to also help the people who are working on those small building blocks that are being built upon. And
one thing, may I?
Sorry, one last thing I wanted to make a point before I end my point, my spiel is it's somewhere in there they write down that it's easy for companies to pay for features, but not for paying for what's needed. Example, project management, stuff like Zulip, Zoom, all these kind of things. This Week in Rust is being sponsored by Rust Foundation. We
very much thank them for paying the email list bills.
Yeah. Well, that's what I'm trying to say is that companies are willing to help out the language itself, but not all the extra stuff that people don't ever really notice because it's not in the in front of you.
The Community Grants Project program has there is one line that I really like, which is that it's a no strings attached sponsorship. And so there are kind of no fishhooks involved in receiving a grant, which is just it's extremely important because we don't want people to feel we want to be an empowering community, and actually operating at a high trust, I think is the best for the long-term future of the language.
This past week, and it'll be featured in next week's This Week in Rust podcast, is the list of community grants recipients, which I had known for a while, being on the board of the foundation. But after it was released, seeing the joy from all of the recipients posting about it on Twitter and seeing the support and congratulations coming from the entire Rust community, we've had some drama on Twitter in the Rust community. I mean, every community has, but seeing this just extensive joy suddenly being expressed was wonderful to witness.
No, that's I'm curious with these kind of profile pieces how they get written, because someone has clearly put in a lot of work to interview some very important, well, I say important, but very significant people like Mara and Josh Triplett, and there are other individuals here who are featured. And I also applaud, in this case, it's a blog or a team that I hadn't really encountered before called The Stack. They'd obviously spent a long time kind of getting this piece together, which I think is, in a sense, like a very subtle way that Rust is actually, like, it's going to have to come to terms with the fact that it's mainstream, right? Like, Rust is very...
I'm still coming to terms with that. It's a little strange.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, there was this kind of turning point. I remember... again, I don't want to kind of say, I've been on the internet since the mid-90s, which is actually true, but yeah.
So have I.
Yeah, right. And there was a point back in like 2007, Facebook was kind of super new. And like, I'm based in New Zealand. And at that stage, you had to kind of be part of a group to join into Facebook. Then the group that I could join was like New Zealand, the group, like as if the whole country was a university or something, right? And like sooner or later, you have these brands becoming everywhere. And I don't know when Rust is going to stop, because it's genuinely good. Like the engineering behind it, the ethos behind it, it just seems like there's a lot of pluses. And if we can do something about people spending, let's say, 8 to, let's say, some sort of dozens of hours and getting like wanting to table flip. Like there comes a point where you just get so frustrated with the borrow checker or something, you're getting some error that you can't diagnose because you haven't imported the right trait. And so a method that you can see in some documentation isn't actually available for your type, and you can't figure out like what's happening. If we can figure out those, then I think Rust is a very, very strong future.
Something this article mentions is the open source open source software security plan, which was presented to the White House in May. Bit of a funny story. I worked on that report, and along with many, many others. But I couldn't talk about it until after it was presented at the White House. I think it was presented in the morning, a White House summit. And then that afternoon, I messaged Beck. Thankfully, she was still awake. She's in Europe. I'm in on the Pacific coast of the US. And she jumped on a call with me, and I said to her, okay, so this thing about Rust was just presented to the White House this morning. You might get some questions about this, and I thought you should know. And she took awesome. It in great stride. And,
nice.
And yeah.
Yeah, it's really tricky being like behind the embargo, right? It's actually harder than not being on it's really challenging. And I think the point around like what these big megacorps can do, and having individuals in there kind of participating in sense with the kind of their dual roles, like dual allegiances. They've got this allegiance in some sense to their employer and obligations that are there, but also this kind of allegiance or kind of an affiliation with the Rust community and its kind of own. And there's this intersection of and that is, I'm not making much sense, but what I want to say is that I think we're doing a good job getting participation from a lot of players. I would really like to see more non-US based companies as platinum members. We've got Huawei there, which is, I think, extremely important. And I think actually having someone like Rebecca from Europe, although I'm sure she's probably feeling like she has to call herself from the UK at the moment. Having her there is kind of like this, a nod to saying, well, actually, Rust is a worldwide thing. And I think that there are challenges, but the future looks really bright. We've kind of hit on some really big issues or big themes in today's discussion, and I appreciate everyone's time. So as I kind of try to wind up, what I would like to really encourage people to do who are listening is to kind of contribute to the discussion. Again, I just kind of have a very small shout out to some of the channels that are available to you as a participant in the community. You're more than welcome to join the Rustacean Station Discord server, as well as, let's say, the Rust community one as well, or if those are not your preference, or there are other places too to participate. And hopefully there are bits and pieces that you've agreed with and bits and pieces that you've disagreed with, and let's come together and continue the discussion. So thank you both. It's been a really pleasurable hour or so.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Nell. You're going to be asked to come back here, by the way.
I would love to come back.
Okay, cheers everyone. Bye-bye.